are. We are a DevOps consultancy, and we've been around for 5 years. Our purpose is to deliver innovation by creating high-performing organizations. So this is one of our Meetup groups. We also have 2 other OC groups that we're in charge of: the OC DevOps, the OC HashiCorp user group, and also the Docker group. He's nodding, he knows. So if you want to check those groups out as well, if you're not sick of us by the end of this meetup, feel free to check them out. And if you have questions, I'm more than happy to answer it for you. We also do have a short survey to go around at the end of the presentation, just to get your feedback of what you thought of the meetup, comments, your input, because we would love to make these meetups fun and engaging for all of us, so you can find the most value in it. And come on, we're going to be here for 2 hours, so let's make the best out of it. Yes? So before we let me go ahead and introduce our speaker for tonight. He is the founder and CEO of Exosphere. So let's give a round of applause to Alan Ham.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys all for coming out and making it out. This is a great audience. Really what we're here to talk about tonight is this problem that I see in a lot of different enterprises. Everywhere I go, everywhere I see, I've experienced it myself as a customer, is that, hey, in this cloud world, it's really easy for your costs to get out of hand. And so how can we attack and handle that problem and bring those cloud costs back down to earth? Before we get started, a little bit of about myself. Right, I'm an engineer by trade. I went to UCLA, studied computer science at UCLA. Spent most of my career at various enterprise software companies, in particular a lot in management systems. But anyway, so the point is that I've come from a very technical background, right? And a lot of the ideas and concepts and the reason why I started Exosphere is based off of my own personal real-world experience. I was most recently, before Exosphere, a VP of engineering at a digital media company where we did a pretty decent-sized cloud migration and had to deal with all the subsequent pain after that migration of dealing with cost. And so a lot of that experience is what led into the foundation of Exosphere. A little bit about Exosphere. We are an enterprise software company that's focused on helping people save money on their cloud bill. Right? And the way we do that is we have an intelligent orchestration platform that leverages AWS Spot instances in cases where you normally weren't able to use Spot instances. So a little bit about my talk tonight. We'll touch on Spot, and you'll get a little bit of a flavor of that. And if you want to talk more about that afterwards, more than happy to do so. I definitely want to make this a kind of interactive speech. So please, raise your hand, ask any questions along the way, stop me. That's totally cool. I'm a firm believer that there's no such thing as a dumb question, just as long as you're a firm believer there's no such thing as a dumb answer. Other than that, let's dive right in. All right, so this is the world we live in. Everyone normally pictures the cloud as this, this utopian world of bright lights and everything. We're going to save money and everything's better in the cloud. We're more agile. We do things faster. Right? But the reality is, once you get there, your picture looks a little bit more like this, with the rain clouds in the background, right? And you start to see that bill come in month over month, and maybe you have your boss over your shoulder, or maybe you are the boss looking at that bill, right? And you're realizing, oh my gosh, this is starting to come out of hand. I need to do something about this today, right? And this is a common problem. If you ask any CIO of any major corporation today, 80% chance when you ask them, what is your top concern about your cloud environment, 80% chance they're going to say cost as their number one answer. If cost isn't their number one answer, it's their number 2 answer. Right? So you are not alone in this problem. Right? Everybody is suffering from this today. And the good news is that there's techniques and solutions out there to help combat this. This is a solvable problem. This isn't something we have to fight with. We can actually use our engineering skills and engineer our way out of this problem. Right? And so we're going to talk a lot tonight about different ways that you can do that. Right? When you look at cost in the cloud, there's really 2 angles that you have to minimize cost. Right? There's cost optimization, which is all about how do I take what I'm currently doing and make it cheaper to run. Right? And then there's the other side of the equation, which is governance, right? And how do I make sure that I don't let my engineers have this free reign to be able to go spin up 10,000 instances and I get this crazy bill at the end of the year. But at the same time, I want to keep them productive, right? So those are really the two angles here. You have optimization and governance. Today, we're going to focus mostly on the optimization side of things. Governance is also very important, and I recommend you guys look into solutions in that area. But governance isn't as fun of a topic to talk about, so we're going to focus on the optimization side of things. All right, so before we dive in, first question I have for you guys is, where are we spending all this money? We get this giant bill back, right? And there's a lot of different services that Amazon's providing that we're subscribing to and using and doing our business with. Where do you guys think, where's the bulk of your spending today, right? Like anybody out there, like look at your bill. What are you spending it on?
EC2.
EC2, number one answer, always. So if you look at compute or EC2, it typically is about 70% of your bill on average. 70% is coming from EC2. So if you're going to try to say, hey, I'm an engineer, I'm going to optimize my way out of this problem, that's a really good place to focus because that's where the overwhelming majority of your spend is coming from. Next biggest area is going to be on the storage side, so the combination of both S3 and EBS volumes. And then everything else that you could think of is on average about 10% of the bill. Right? So it kind of gives us an idea of where we should be focusing in. It's mostly on compute. Let's look a little bit at storage. Everything else, yeah, okay, maybe we'll do some things here and there if it's easy, but if you focus on those two things, you're going to have a tremendous amount of cost savings. All right, so throughout the night, we're going to go and I'm going to have different cost savings tips, and we'll kind of dive into each one of them and understand what they're all about. Some of these things are things that you probably already know. Some of them are things that are hopefully new to you. And maybe there's one or two of you where everything I talk about you already know. In that case, be glad that there's free beer. All right, so cost savings tip number one. And this is by far and away the single best thing you could do to save costs. And if you're not doing it today, you should be doing it. This is what everybody absolutely should be doing, and I'm shocked at how many people aren't doing it. And it's so simple. It's just buy reserved, right? This is kind of a no-brainer. Why wouldn't you buy reserved? There's so many companies out there that have not had the time and taken the effort to go and plan out a process of buying reserved instances. And it's so simple and easy, right? So let's dive into a little bit about reserved instances and why it's so important and how easy it is to actually do.
What's the percentage that you recommend for coverage?
Yeah, we'll get to that in a second, but often it's that 70 to 80%. All right, so before we talk about reserve, let's first talk about, hey, what are all the ways we could buy from Amazon, right? We're talking about compute primarily because that's 70% of our bill. What are all the different ways that we could buy computing power from Amazon, right? So of course, we have on-demand. That's what Amazon started as. AWS was all the elastic cloud, on-demand, use what you need, right? And this is awesome and great for so many different reasons and we all love it. It also happens to be the most expensive option because it's the most flexible, right? When you have something that's super flexible, it costs the most. Right, so Amazon then came out with reserved instances, right? And reserved instances are nothing more than a contractual commitment. Hey, I'm going to use this resource for 1 or 3 years. I know I'm going to use it. I might as well make that contractual commitment and recognize some savings in it. Third, they offer a spot market, right? And so we're all pretty technical people here, so hopefully a lot of us are familiar with spot. For those of you who aren't, the spot market is essentially Amazon's excess capacity. Right? And they have found a way to monetize that excess capacity, which is great for Amazon. It's also great for the customer because you could save a tremendous amount of money, upwards of 80–90% off of the on-demand rate. And so Spot is near and dear to my heart. It's what a lot of what our company Exosphere is founded on. So we'll touch a little bit on that in the talk tonight. And then definitely, if you have any questions on this, please come see me afterwards because this is something I could talk about all night long. And then the last option we have is dedicated hosts. There's really only 2 reasons you would ever buy a dedicated host from Amazon, and that is one, for licensing reasons. I want to host an Oracle database, and Oracle database is tied to that host, and for licensing purposes, I need to control the vCPUs that are in that host. Right? That's one reason. It's pure licensing restrictions. The only other reason is I'm forced to do so because of some regulatory compliance. Right? Depending on what industry you're in, maybe there's some reason why you have to be on a dedicated host. Other than that, most of the time, most people are not dealing with these things. Those are really the only 2 reasons. So we're going to focus primarily on those first 3 throughout this talk. All right, so reserved instances. You know, we probably all know about them. Hopefully most of us are using them. If not, tomorrow, go buy some. Right? Why do we have reserved instances? What's the benefit to them? Right? Well, when reserved instances started, you look at the name reserved, it actually served a purpose other than cost savings. It really was about reserving capacity, right? This was in the very early days of AWS, and they had this fear of, oh, what if we don't have the capacity to spin up an instance when a customer wants it, right? And so they created this concept of reserved instances to guarantee that you had that capacity, right? Well, now, I've been working now with AWS for well over 8 years. I never once, myself personally, or any single friend of mine that I've ever worked in the industry, have ever had a time where we tried to spin up an on-demand instance and it wasn't available, right? It's just simply not a problem, given the way of Amazon's scale today. Right, so really when people talk about reserved instances, yes, they still have this reservation quality to them, but really it's all about the cost savings, right? And that's a pretty significant cost savings. On average, it's about 40% over the on-demand rate. So there's really no reason why you shouldn't be using reserved instances if you have somewhat of a predictable workload that you know for the next year that I'm going to need these things. Reserved instances come in a few different flavors, right? So there's standard, convertible, and scheduled. Right? A standard reserved instance was kind of like the original model. It's pretty restrictive of what you could do with it. Right? So if I buy a reserved instance for an M5 extra large, I'm kind of locked into that M5 family. I could trade it in and go to an M5 2 extra large, or go down in size, but I'm locked into the M5 family. I can't trade it in for anything else. So I'm committed to using that same resource for the whole entirety of my contract. On the next option, convertible, it's much more flexible. I could take any instance type and convert it to any other instance type, right? So again, it's more flexible, but the cost savings isn't as much. These days, I recommend people stick with the convertible instances, just because our workloads are so unpredictable that even if we know we're going to have a certain workload, our application is going to change inevitably over the next year, especially over the next 3 years. Convertible instances offer a level of flexibility, and the cost difference, while it is there, it's not unsurmountable, right? So it's kind of a play in the middle here to save significantly, but still have that flexibility. Lastly, we have scheduled reserved instances, which a lot of people don't really even know exist. They're really interesting, fascinating things where you could define a particular schedule, whether it's hours of a day or maybe a month of the year. So if you're in the retail business and you have a Black Friday sale every year in November, right, that is a great opportunity to use these scheduled reserve instances. You can also do things of, hey, maybe my QA and dev environment, I shut it down on the weekends, or shut it down at night because nobody's using it, but I'm using it during the day. So you could schedule it to say, hey, only during business hours, I'm going to reserve these instances. So it's another way of, refining the scope of what that reservation is for. It's more directly applicable to your use case, and you can still save a really significant amount of money. As far as, yeah.
Are we allowed to ask questions?
Yeah, please.
How do reserved instances work with things like Exosphere?
Yeah, so reserved instances are purely a billing play, right? There is no difference technically whatsoever, and this is one of the main reasons why everybody should be doing it. You don't have to make any changes to anything. It really is just establishing that contract with AWS, and it's purely a billing relationship. So your instances continue to run as they're just like on-demand instances. In fact, there's no way to tell the difference between an on-demand instance and a reserved instance. They are the same thing. It's just what happens on the bill and how you get charged for it. So technically speaking, they're exactly the same thing, which is a really good thing to point out. So they come in 1 or 3 year options. Typically we see most people are doing 1 years, although if you're in a pretty mature business, you could certainly reach out to the 3 year level. And they come in 3 different flavors in terms of your payment options, right? You could pay for the whole thing upfront and not have to pay a cent more for the rest of the term. You could pay part of it upfront and pay the rest of it monthly over time, or you could say, I don't want to pay anything upfront and I'm going to pay it all over time. So there's flexibility there in the payment arrangements depending on the maturity and size of your company, how important cash flow is to you, right? If you're a huge company and you're sitting on a pile of cash, maybe you go with the all up front. If you're a startup company and cash flow is extremely important to you, you probably go with the no up front, right? So that you're not impacting your cash flow at all. Most of the time, what we see is somewhere in the middle is always a good spot, and that's why a lot of people land on that partial up front. And then lastly about reserved instances, this is what defines what that reservation can be used for. So it uses a concept called attribute matching, right? And so when you buy a reservation, you're buying an instance type, a platform, like an OS, whether it's Linux or Windows, a tenancy model, and an availability zone. Those are the 4 things that combine that reservation. There is a little bit of flexibility on that last one in terms if you have convertible instances or even the standard instances, you could move from one AZ to the other, but you have to jump through a little bit of hoop to do that with Amazon. But for the most part, you can. But those first 3 are locked in. If you have a Windows OS, you can't swap it in for a Linux OS. Their model doesn't allow for it. All right, so let's talk. So now that we know a little bit about reserved instances, hopefully we knew a lot of that before, but if you didn't and you learned something new, that's great too. Let's talk about best practices when it comes to buying reserved instances. So to this gentleman's question earlier, right, how many reserved instances should we buy? So the goal is, if you look at your on-demand usage, you should be having about 70 to 80% of that reserved. That's the ideal, right? And I highlight the fact that it's on-demand usage, right? Because we'll talk a little bit about spot usage in a little bit, and it's really important that you separate that out when you're looking at your reservation planning. You want to look at how many on-demand instances am I using, and my goal is to get to about 70, 80% of that. If you're a really, really well-established company, my last company, we pushed the envelope a little bit. We got as high as like 85, 86%. That's really kind of pushing it. Much more than that, you lose the predictability, right? And there's nothing worse than paying for a reserved instance that you don't use. Like, right, yeah, there's this marketplace you could sell them on after the fact, but nobody actually uses that, and you lose a lot of money, and it's kind of a joke. Right? And so at the end of the day, you don't want to over-provision your reserved instances. You want to make sure that you're well within your range. And so that 80% mark gives us a good flexibility of, hey, we're getting a lot of cost savings, but we're not over-committing ourselves, and we have the flexibility to change our applications over time and change how they work and what the workloads look like. Next best practices is don't buy your reserved instances all at once. Right? Don't go and just say, oh, I need 75% reserved instances, and boom, one day and buy them all. Right? Spread out those purchases throughout the year, right? And what that, again, it's all about flexibility, right? And that gives you the opportunity to say, when those are up for renewal, I can have more opportunities to kind of change my mix, right? If I only have one purchase a year, I have to wait till next year before I make any changes. If I spread them out throughout the year, now I have more opportunities to make changes to that mix. So it's just about flexibility, right? And I would recommend at least 2 purchases throughout a year, ideally 4, so it's a quarterly cadence. It's not that bad. You don't want to overdo it. Like monthly is probably going to be too much because then you're just going to be constantly buying reserved instances. But I would say quarterly is the ideal, and if you're just a totally, you guys don't have time to work on anything like everybody else, at least stick to 2 times a year. I already mentioned partial upfront. This is kind of the de facto standard for most people. It's the best combination of value and flexibility, right? It's not impacting my cash flow, but I'm still saving a pretty good chunk of change. The other thing to realize is that reserved instances are not just for EC2. You could buy reserved in a whole bunch of Amazon services. You could buy things like RDS and Redshift and Elasticache and EMR. You could buy DynamoDB and even CloudFront, you could buy reserved capacity, right? And so you should look at whatever these services you're using. If you're meeting a certain threshold of usage in that service, you should be buying reserved, right? It's a no-brainer. It's just a billing exercise. Do it if you're not doing it today. Bottom line, right? And lastly, it's like how do I go about planning for these reserved instances, right? There's a couple of tools out there that can help you do this. There's a lot of commercial tools out there. Maybe you've heard of some of the Cloud Health, which just got bought by VMware, Cloudability. There used to be Cloud Checker, Cloud fill in the blank name here, right? There's a lot of tools out there, commercial offerings that help you that are all great products and certainly are worth their value. They typically charge a percentage of saving, a percentage of your cloud bill. So typically like 1 to 2% of your bill. So if that's something that doesn't scare you, they're probably ROI positive products. If that does scare you, there's some free alternatives that you could use. One, there's the Trusted Advisor service that's built into AWS, which is really handy that a lot of people don't look at ever, but I recommend go take a look at it. They have some recommendations there on how to buy reserved instances. And then 2, if you're more of a hands-on type of person, we're all technical engineers here, the best thing you could possibly do is take the AWS cost report and insert it into Redshift. They make this really easy to do. Go into the billing section of your AWS console. There'll be a little export button there. They'll dump a SQL file that you just import into your Redshift. And now you have it in an actual usable format. I could run queries on it. I could look at things that, before I couldn't very easily. So I highly recommend, if you're going to try the do-it-yourself approach to reservation planning, definitely take your report and put it into Redshift so that you can query on it in a useful way. And then lastly on our, yeah, go ahead.
I would just say, I would add that being notified when the reservation is going to expire, because a lot of people miss that.
Absolutely, absolutely. So Trusted Advisor does have settings in there to help you notify you. And if you have there's nothing worse than, hey, I bought this reserved instance, my year is up, and I forgot about it. They do not auto-renew. That's a really good point. You have to stay on top of it, and you renew it. There's no Amazon rep that's going to call you and say, hey, it's time to buy your reserved instances. It may be if you're large enough, they do, I guess. But for the most part, that doesn't happen. And so definitely stay on top of it. Put something on your calendar. Know when those dates are coming up. And use Trusted Advisor to help you with those more early warnings, because they will tell you when things are about to expire. So I mentioned a little bit about Spot, right? Spot instances, we'll get in more detail later in the talk, but when you're talking about reserved, make sure you identify your Spot strategy first. Because once you buy those reservations, you're committed. If all of a sudden I buy these reservations and then I come up with this awesome Spot strategy that's going to save me a ton of money, guess what? I can't take advantage of it until those reservations expire. So order of operations here, do Spot first, then look at reserved instances after. All right, cost savings tip number 2. Turn shit off, guys. Don't leave it running. This is so easy to do, right? People leave shit running all the time, and it costs a lot of money, right? This is just us not even thinking about it, right? We're just going through the motions, right? But turn your stuff off and also delete it. Sometimes there's a lot of services out there that when you do something, it actually, even if you're not using it, it's sitting there, it's still costing you money. EBS volumes, elastic IP addresses, load balancers, all that stuff sitting idle is costing you money. So we'll go through a series of things right now that you could do to turn stuff off and save some money, right? So first up is elastic IP addresses, right? Now this is not, you think, elastic IP addresses, who cares about elastic IP address? Well, an elastic IP address that's not being used costs you $45 a year. Okay, that doesn't sound huge, $45 a year, no problem, right? But I have been in environments where they have hundreds of unused elastic IP address, hundreds, right? So you're spending upwards of $10,000 a year for something you're not using. That's just dumb, right? And so really, especially when it's so easy to find in Spot, right? This is all you have to do to find your unused elastic IP addresses. Take this little snippet, put it in your command line, boom, there's the elastic IP addresses that you should be releasing, right? And if you guys, I'll definitely post all the slides, and if you want any of like the snippets of code or anything like that I post, don't feel like you have to take pictures or write it down. You can always reach out to me, and I'll make sure that you get anything you need. And then, so once you identified it, next step, release them. So it's essentially the exact same command, but now with a subsequent command to delete them, right? So like, what does that look like in our environment here? I have a little example of just running these commands. It's so simple, so easy to do. It's like, why wouldn't you do it? So if I just simply run that command, look, boom, I have 2 unused elastic IP addresses. That's it. Let's go delete them, right? It's as simple as copy and pasting this line. Let's go delete those elastic IP addresses. Boom. Why wouldn't I be doing this? This is so simple. It takes 2 seconds of my time. They're gone. And like I said, in some environments, you can be saving upwards of thousands and thousands of dollars a year.
Are there demos? It's on the screen.
Oh, that's interesting. I'm not sure about that, but thank you for pointing that out. We'll dive into that as we go. All right. All right, well, the next one, I'll find a better way of doing that. All right, but thank you for pointing that out. All right, next up on the list, load balancers. Delete unused load balancers. Again, it's as simple as running a simple clean command. Take this clean command, run it, hey, there you go, delete them, right? Same thing. A load balancer costs you $220 per year if it's idle. Just sitting there doing nothing, $220 a year. And again, you can go into environments, and there's dozens of these that are unused, right? So you can save thousands of dollars simply by deleting something. Same thing goes for EBS volumes. Look for orphaned EBS volumes. We all spin up instances, we tear them down. That EBS volume, that stays there. Unless you actually go out of your way to clean it up, it's going to stay there. And over time, you will collect a lot of EBS volumes that are unused. A 100 gigabyte ESB volume costs you, again, about $220 per year, right? So that's pretty significant. And these are really easy to collect. This is probably the most likely to collect in your environment of all these three things. You probably have the most EBS volumes that are unattached anyway. Now, once you run this command, don't go and delete them. Check to make sure you don't need them, right? There may be a reason why somebody turned off that instance and they want that for later. Go talk to your team, right? And after you check that it's not needed, go double check that it's not needed, right? Go talk to them again and double check. And after you double check, triple check, right? This is, once you delete it, it's gone. And there are valid cases of why people leave these laying around. So you don't want to automatically delete them. And then when you do go and delete them one by one. Don't go and do a bulk operation of, hey, I'm going to just wipe out all these EBS volumes, because this is potentially really sensitive information, so be smart about it. Next up is EBS snapshots. So EBS snapshots cost half as much as what an EBS volume does, but again, you're taking snapshots all the time, and if you don't have a good way of cleaning up those snapshots, they add up really quickly. So Amazon does have a nice service called the Data Lifecycle Manager. And what this job is to help you automate and schedule taking snapshots, and also set a retention policy on those snapshots. So I could say, hey, only keep snapshots for the past however long, right? And it will automatically delete and rotate those snapshots so that you don't get out of hand on the cost. And if you're going to use the DLM, you need to create an IAM role. You can either do a custom role, or you can use the default role, really simple to create with that snippet. And then you could also create a DLM policy with this command line here, right here. That policy is all set in a JSON file, so that's really where the crux of it lives. And that JSON file looks a little bit something like this. I know it's a little small to see, but essentially you have in here is a schedule, right? Where you could say, hey, this is my daily snapshot schedule. So every day, every 24 hours, I'm going to create a snapshot of these EBS volumes. And then I have a retention rule here at the bottom, meaning I'm going to keep the last 5 of them. So maybe that's good for your environment. Every application is different. Figure out what makes sense. But please, please, put a policy in place. Don't just let it grow unwieldy out of hand, right? Everybody loves EBS snapshots because it helps save us, right? It protects us from data loss and all those great advantages. Don't let it get out of hand, though. Only save what you need. And then lastly, we mentioned Trusted Advisor already, but let's look a little bit more at what are some of the things that Trusted Advisor could do for us, right? It will identify EC2 instances that are low on utilization. So the developer who spun up that instance for a test 8 months ago and then let it sit there, Trusted Advisor will help point that out to you, and you can go and shut down that resource. Idle load balancers it also will detect, so that's another way of doing it instead of using that command line I just showed you. It will also show you underutilized EBS volumes, not necessarily ones that are unattached, but ones that are attached, but they're just, hey, the application isn't using them, so why are they even there, right? Unassociated elastic IP addresses like we talked, as well as RDS instances and Redshift clusters. All of those are done. It also does some funky stuff with Route 53 if you're using latency resource record sets, which is kind of like a distributed DNS, so that wherever I am in the world, I hit the closest DNS server. A lot of times that gets misconfigured and it can cost you a lot of money, so Trusted Advisor helps identify some of those pitfalls for you. All right, moving on. Cost savings tip number 3. Schedule your usage. Right? Now, if we're dealing with a production environment, you probably need that up to be running all the time, right? So let's not schedule that. But how much of our spend is actually on production environments, right? We all have dev environments, test environments, QA environments, staging environments, right? All of these resources, they don't need to be up and running 24/7, right? Maybe you have a development team that follows the sun, but most of us don't, right? So turn that stuff off in the middle of the night when nobody's using it, right? Turn it off on the weekends when nobody's there. Right? It's really simple and easy to do. So Amazon actually offers a solution to this. They call it the AWS Instance Scheduler. This is one of these solutions that a lot of people don't even know existed. It's published by Amazon. Essentially, it's a cloud formation stack that you install into your account, and it controls the scheduling of resources. So it works with EC2 or RDS instances, right? And the way it works is you configure these things called periods and schedules, right? So a period might be something like defining business hours, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m., or maybe you want to go 6 a.m. to to 10 p.m., right? Whatever it might be. So you define that period of time. And then a schedule is an application of that period, right? So business hours in Pacific time zone would be a schedule, right? And so you create these periods and schedules, and then you apply them via tags to individual resources within your Amazon account. And then there is a Lambda function. So this is kind of what the architecture of this scheduler looks like. There's a Lambda function that's at the center of it. It's triggered by a CloudWatch event on a timer basis. I think it's about every 5 minutes. That's customizable, but about every 5 minutes, this Lambda function will fire off. It looks at all the instances that you have tagged with an individual schedule, and it stores some state information in DynamoDB. And then it looks at those schedules, and pretty much all it's doing is shutting down and turning up instances at the right time based on your schedule. Really simple concept, but really easy to install and do, right? And so to do it, really, and all it is launching a CloudFormation stack. Let me see now if we could do a better demo here. Oh, no, my link doesn't work because I'm in this mode. All right, so if we click on that button, it just launches a simple CloudFormation stack. We could go through this wizard. It's very simple though. All it does, there's a bunch of settings that you could here. You could kind of schedule and do whatever you want, change the parameters of this section. But you run this and install it. It's going to launch, and it takes literally 2 minutes to install in your account. Then the way it works is if we go into our Dynamo, it's going to create. I've already run this, right? So if I go to my CloudFormation stacks here, you'll see that I've already run this earlier today. And so we have this, I named it Exosphere Scheduler. But it created a whole bunch of objects in here, creating DynamoDB tables and all that Lambda functions and all that kind of stuff. So if we go into the DynamoDB table itself, you could actually go and create your own schedules, and your own periods, and then use those to apply onto your various resources. So in here we have this config table, and if we look at the items in here, here are some of the schedules and periods that we have created. So again, we have like office hours, right? Or UK office hours is an actual schedule of that. Right, so now I could go and I could take this UK office hours schedule, and all I have to do is go to an EC2 instance. If I go over to my instances view, oh, I don't have any in East. Let's go over to the Western region. So I take one of those EC2 instances, and I just add a tag here that says schedule, and I have set it to UK office hours. Boom, I'm done. That guy is now scheduled. Now that instance will automatically get shut down at every evening at 6 p.m. and it will start up automatically every morning at 9 a.m. So it's a really easy way of scheduling your resources for all your not high priority environments, so dev, QA, staging, etc. All right, so let's go back here to our deck. Next up on a cost savings tip number 4 is minimize data transfer. Nobody really thinks about data transfer, but it is quite expensive in Amazon. They don't charge you for anything coming in, right? They want you to merge workloads into Amazon, and they want to remove all that friction and all the cost associated with it. So getting anything in is free. Getting anything out costs a lot of money, right? So if you're doing anything in a multi-cloud environment, this is something to really be careful about. Even within availability zones, you're getting charged for all that data transfer between availability zones. So you really want to be careful when you have applications that are distributed in nature. So things like Cassandra or Kafka or any of these other large, big NoSQL distributed databases, right? Really think through your model there. And the recommendation here is I know there's a huge trade-off, right? But you want to reduce your cost, you want to try to locate them as much as you can in the same AZ. Now sometimes your business requirements are going to say, no, we need to have the redundancy of multiple AZs depending on the application. And of course that's always going to trump, right? If you have those legitimate business reasons to do that, please still do that. But if you don't, kind of really think about those business cases, right? If you're running a consumer product, chances are you probably don't need prices. Leverage Spot Fleet. So Spot Fleet will do those first two things for you automatically. It handles the diversification and it handles that bidding process for you, right? And so it's a really easy tool to use to get a whole big bunch of spot instances up and running at once. It's a pretty flexible tool. And then lastly, if you want to use spot instances in those cases where it was not what they were intended for, maybe you want to use it for your RESTful web services that have really high uptime requirements. There's offerings out there like Exosphere that can help you save a significant amount of money using spot instances in those cases as well. Right? Using Spot Fleet, you could imagine that you could typically get about 95% availability, which is pretty awesome. I get 95% availability at that much of a discounted rate. That's awesome. If your application requires more than that, go with a commercial solution that could then help you in those cases. Just to put it in context, 95% availability is 1 day a month. It's going to go down. Right? So with Spot Fleet, you can imagine that I'm going to get interrupted that could potentially impact my application 1 day in a month. So if you're doing video transcoding jobs in the background, great, that's not a problem. But if you have a customer-facing web application and it goes down 1 day a month, that's a little bit of a problem, right? And so in those cases, use the extra tools to help you, and you could still save a tremendous amount of money.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
If you have a spot instance that you said you wanted to be the on-demand price, why would AWS terminate your instance other than some maintenance job?
Yeah, so the two reasons AWS would terminate is because of they need it for capacity reasons. So there's enough people spinning up on demand that they need it to fulfill an on-demand request, or they're doing maintenance or anything like that. They need that capacity for some reason, or the price spikes, right? And there are cases where the spot market, the price may go above the on-demand rate. And it happens based on demand, right? It's a market-driven price. So if there's enough people and enough demand out there, that price will go up, up, and up. And at some point, it's going to hit that on-demand rate. And you're actually better off going over to an on-demand instance at that point in time. A lot of times, you'll see this. It's really common with GPU instances. So all the GPU classes, quite frequently, the prices will go above the on-demand rate just because GPUs are in such high demand. And there's not enough of them for the demand that the market, the price goes up. It's just like supply and demand, just like any other economics.
Is it up for bidding every 2 minutes? Or
What's that?
the resource that you get is up for bidding in the next 2 minutes?
Yeah. Well, you mean when it gets terminated?
So I claim an instance, so I'm allocated an instance. But how long after that Amazon starts bidding that again?
If they if they terminate you within an hour, they don't charge you for that hour. If you terminate it, then they do charge you. So they do. It's per second billing now. Everything on AWS is per second. But if you're using spot instances and you spin up an instance and it's up for 49, 59 minutes, and all of a sudden Amazon terminates it, you don't get charged at all. So if they terminate you, it's free. If you choose to have it terminated, then it does cost you for whatever the per second billing.
Yeah, well, not a best practice, but if you can, use spot instances in another region other than US East 1, because that's like the most popular region by default. Everybody goes there, and spot prices are kind of higher in that region.
Yeah, it's interesting. It really depends on the family and size, right? I agree with you. If you're using the latest generation, they typically are higher in US East, and so that's a really good recommendation. If you're using some of the older ones, sometimes you actually might get surprised because there's more of a surplus there than there are in other regions. So really, look at what instance types you're using. Amazon makes it really easy to go look at the spot price history in the console, and you can see the chart over time. Figure out where you're using and what your best bet is. But yeah, I absolutely agree. And by the way, it's if you're going to set anything up new, I always recommend going outside of US East 1 anyway, right? I mean, that's kind of the test bed, if you will, and it just so happens that all of Amazon's outages are always in US East 1, right? So they have never had an outage in US West 2. Yep.
So in a regular situation when, let's say, the price for the spot instance, let's say, which is up to the on-demand price, then what happens at that point? Like if you have set that price to the on-demand price, that spot instance goes there, but then you have to manually provision the compatible EC2 instance if you want to keep the same number of instances no matter what kind of application?
Yeah. So if you're using like Spot Fleet and all of that kind of stuff, when that instance goes away, and it may try to spin up another Spot instance for you, but what will happen 5% of the time is that it can't spin up anything, right? You have no instances available, and your application is now down, right? And so that's why you want to make sure that you're using it in the proper use cases if you're using Spot Fleet, or if you're using a commercial offering like Exosphere. What we do is we handle that for you, and we fail back over to on-demand instances and allow you to have a hybrid collection of both Spot and on-demand, which is something that Amazon doesn't allow you to do natively. So that's kind of the key there. So if you have something that really has high uptime availability requirements, go ahead with using one of these commercial offerings. If it doesn't, then you could use Spot Fleet.
Did I hear it right? You suggested not to use USS1?
I'm just saying, if I had this is my own personal experience, but yeah, if I was starting a brand new installation, I would not use USS1.
Use US West 2, is that?
US West 2, US East 2. I mean, US West 1 is more expensive, but I would do US West 2 or US East 2. And those, they're just as cheap, and they're second generation data centers. US East 1 was their first generation, and if you notice, like all of their big failures and everything have always been in US East 1, for whatever reason. So I'm just basing that purely off of just historical experiences, and there's no real facts around that. It's just that would be my personal recommendation.
Your concern is reliability, not price.
Yeah. Just from I mean, if you look at every single major outage that Amazon has had, it's always with US East. So for that reason alone, I would if you can, and you have the choice. If you're already there, I wouldn't recommend moving or anything. It's not going to be worth it to move. But if you're starting from scratch or you're starting something new, and that's what I would recommend. Yeah.
Just curious. You were talking about hybrid there, and kind of what you guys do, and I'm assuming what other commercial entities do as well. Are you guys buying those on-demand instances yourself as a company? And then when somebody's using your application or your service, and they hit that threshold, and then they would normally die, but you switch them over to one of your instances, or
No.
or do you purchase it under the company?
It's still within your account.
So your account.
Yeah, it's still within your account on your bill, and essentially what we're doing is
So
we're So we're augmenting auto-scaling functionality so that you auto-scale out onto on-demand, and then we replace those instances with Spot instances. But when they get terminated, your auto-scaling group spins up on-demand again, right? And so you kind of have this hybrid collection of Spot and on-demand within a single auto-scaling group.
So somebody would be paying for the on-demand instances?
Right. Yeah. So maybe 95% of the time you're paying the Spot rate, and 5% of the time you're paying the on-demand rate. The difference being that during that 5% of the time, my application is still up and running. Right. I'm not impacted. Right. Whereas the native Amazon tools, it's all or nothing. You're all Spot or you're all on demand. All right. Cost savings tip number 9: right size instances. Right. This is one that is if you noticed over the time of this course of this lecture, we're getting progressively harder and harder on things to do. We started off with the super easiest reserved instances, coming up to Spot instances. That's a little bit more work. Now, right sizing is an intensive process, but it does have a lot of benefits from a cost savings perspective, and it can be worthwhile. Amazon also does have a right sizing solution similar to their scheduling solution. It's a CloudFormation stack that you install into your account, and it analyzes your utilization. It actually comes with a series of Python scripts that actually run on your instances, kind of like a little mini agent, if you will. It's looking at aspects of that instance, reporting back, and then it will make recommendations on a 2-week period for you. So let's say change this instance from an M5 2 extra large to an M5 extra large. Right? The downside is it must be run on an individual account. So if you have a lot of accounts, it can be somewhat of a little bit of a pain, but that's and it should only be run once every 2 weeks. Right? The results then are then output into a CSV file in an S3 bucket, right? And so this is the solution architecture from Amazon's page. Essentially, like I said, it's CloudWatch events. that are triggering Python scripts that actually then go and execute against your individual EC2 instances, collect data, store that back into S3 in Redshift, it manipulates that data, and then on a regular, and then it will dump out the CSV file back to S3. And the results look something like this. You know, it's a little bit small on there, but you can see over here it's recommending change this M4 extra large to an M3 medium. So that's a really underutilized machine, right? And it'll tell you that by doing that, you're going to save $123 per month. So they make it really easy for you to kind of find opportunities where your biggest bang for your buck is going to be, where you want to spend that time in right sizing.
What about people who bitch about memory metrics? Do you know if that right size is based on that?
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure. I'll have to double check that. I know that you know, memory is not a CloudWatch metric by default, right? You get CPU, you get disk, you get all that very easily. Memory you can't. So it is a little bit. If your application is memory bound and you get a recommendation like that, you probably want to double check and make sure that you're looking into it and it's not misadvising you based on that memorization. There's commercial products out there that, you know, back to the cloud checkers, cloud health, all those guys, they do have agents that run on those machines that do collect memory metrics, and they do make recommendations based on that. So if you do have a lot of memory bound applications, maybe that's a good way to go for you. But yeah, I'm not quite sure. I know this is executing locally on the machine, so it should have access to memory, but I don't see it in the columns here, which makes me think that maybe it's not. So it's a very good point. You know, if you have memory-bound applications, beware. All right, last cost savings tip here, number 10. Explore containers. I know we all already are. Some of us are probably already using them in production. That's great. Containers are just awesome in every which way. It's the future. Everybody's doing it. Jump on the bandwagon, jump off the bridge, whatever it is. There's good reasons to do it. You have the normal technical benefits of containers, you know, consistent environments and development environments. You can run them anywhere. They're isolated, you know, more isolated the better. Great, those are all really good technical advantages. But from a cost savings perspective, it's really significant. The typical efficiency gain by moving over to containers is 50%. Right? So again, if you're looking at your EC2 bill, 70% of your bill is EC2, and I can cut that down by 50% by going to containers, that gives me a really good story of why I should do this. So not only do I get all these other benefits from a technical reason, that's why I want to do it, but I also get cost savings benefit to help fund and pay for that migration activity. Right? So it makes a lot of sense. In these days, it's super easy to get set up using containers. If you don't already have your own container orchestration platform set up, I highly recommend using a service like EKS or even ECS. If you have a choice, I would choose EKS. Or any other container as a service offering. You know, VMware has one, Pivotal has one. A bunch of people have these container as a service offerings. Super easy to spin up clusters. You don't have to worry about it. Just focus on taking your applications and migrating them to containers themselves. But you don't have to worry so much about the infrastructure, and it's really easy to get set up these days. And the cost, you know, is not tremendously high. I would be weary from a cost perspective. You know, there's newer services like Fargate, which are really compelling. Oh, I don't even have to control the servers underneath, right? I don't have to pay for the EC2 usage. It sounds really compelling, but when you do the cost comparison and the cost analysis, it actually becomes quite expensive. So I think EKS is kind of that nice middle ground where it does a lot of that heavy lifting for me. I'm not spinning up my own cluster and managing it myself, but I'm not also spending a tremendous amount of money like on the Fargate solutions. And then lastly, if you're in a container environment, this is a perfect example of where you could use spot instances and save a ton of money. Not necessarily with Spot Fleet and Amazon's tool, but with a commercial offering like Exosphere. You could now, if I'm saving 50% on containers, and then all of a sudden I save another 80 to 90% on top of that, you could make a really significant dent on your bill, and you could take it down from, you know, astronomically high back down to earth. And so containers are definitely worthwhile for everybody to investigate. There's probably a whole other lecture here on how to do this with containers and cost optimization strategies with containers, and maybe we'll do that another time. But I highly recommend, if you're not already doing it today, that you look into them. Like I said, everybody's doing them, they're cool, and it makes sense for a reason. That's all I got. Thank you guys. You've been great. Yeah, I'm certainly happy to answer any questions now. If you can't think of them, I'll be around all night. If you want to learn more about Exosphere and Spot instances, please come find me afterwards. Feel free to reach out to me, email, text me on my cell phone, whatever you need, anytime. If you want any of the snippets on anything that was in the deck, happy to do that. If you just want some advice, I'm happy to give you my advice from my experience. Hopefully we'll talk again soon.